Welcome to another exciting video, or willkommen in einem anderen Aufregungsvideo. This is part 33 of my game system design series. In this case, I'll investigate Napoleonic light infantry. Specifically, how do they differ from other infantry, what were they used for, and what different types of light infantry are there around. As with cavalry, I found the way light infantry portrayed rather puzzling in many sets of rules. Most of my gaming has probably been ancient, and as a result I am used to the ancient concept of different densities of light infantry or infantry, with bases holding from 2 to 4 infantry figures each. However, with Napoleonic rules, it's not as simple as this. Troops could be permanently designated to fight in an open order skirmish formation, or could be used in both standard close order and skirmish order formation, or possibly something in between. Yet how should you base these troops, and how do they differ in, let's say, a typical set of rules? Quick caveat, this is based on really preliminary research, and I have no doubt that there are those with significantly greater expertise on this subject. Thus, it's best to view this as an introduction to Napoleonic light infantry, and certainly not a detailed scholarly analysis. The main purpose was to verify if my basing system for light infantry, or infantry generally, was accurate. As we discover, my opinions on the subject has really changed as a result of this video, requiring me to rebase some of my light infantry. This is annoying, to put it mildly. Just a quick note about the basing. I'm not really designing the basing for any specific set of rules. What I'm attempting to do is ensure that my Napoleonic figures are based in a manner that will allow me to play pretty much any set of rules I wish. I'm going through the process of researching about half a dozen different set of rules, which is the reason why I'm looking at accurate basing. Now, let's go back to the video. When I closely look at French light infantry, or légère, or for the Prussian, their fusiliers, which are also classed as light infantry, I rapidly became rather confused. While the French light infantry were made up of shorter men, they were often used in a standard light infantry mode. Should I base them the same as a light infantry, or should I base them some other density? WIG has a good definition of light infantry. Light infantry, regular infantry whose entire unit is capable of skirmishing with a flintlock musket or rifle, as well as fighting in close order, and who can advance in line as well as column at a quick step. This includes ad hoc units with light infantry titles, formed by amalgamation of the skirmishes of several line battalions, but does not include light battalions which totally skirmish or told off entirely to skirmish, as occasionally happened in French revolutionary armies. Light infantry units normally have special titles, such as light infantry or something similar. However, this is not always the case. The definition that WRG provides is good and concise. The more difficult role is to identify what light infantry units actually fell into this particular definition. The WRG army lists I possess define Prussian fusiliers as light infantry, which means they can fight in the line as well as breaking up fully into a skirmish mode. In the WRG world, you would normally have individual figure elements, so a unit of 16 figures would often consist of one element which is broken up into 2 one-figure mini-elements and 1 two-figure mini-element. If the whole unit could adopt skirmish formation, then you would need to double base the entire unit. For each element of 4 figures, you would also need to have 2 elements of 2 figures each. These could be based on a half base, which is I think what WRG normally prefers, but I prefer full bases, as skirmish mode needs to force significant separation between the figures, and a full base forces this. My DBN elements will remain at 3 figures per element, but I'm now going to double base my light infantry so I can depict them as compact order 4 per elements and skirmish order 2 per elements. This was based on the results of my video analysis. Now, one thing I noticed in investigating rules, specifically Empire 3rd edition rather than WRG, is that Empire had 2 skirmish types of formations. something called semi-skirmish, and something called skirmish formation. And this made me wonder, does this mean that some formations could totally break up in a skirmish formation and some in a semi-form, or something that's not quite the same as, let's say, yaga? Thus you have a difference between, in German terms, Fusiliers and yaga, for example. To understand how this all works, I need to investigate in more detail exactly how skirmishes were used during the Napoleonic era. Now, there was one other thing I needed to clear up, and that was, what about things like yaga, which is basically, in WRG terms, defined as irregular skirmish infantry. Irregular skirmish infantry were irregular infantry whose preferred fighting technique is shooting from cover with rifle, flintlock or matchbox, musket or bow, although they may also be capable of fighting hand-to-hand with sword, knife, hatchet, club or butt. Examples include yaga, grens of the 7-Year War, Red Indians, backwoodsmen and Afghan mercenary matchlock men. These are troops which would never be expected to fight in line and are always skirmishing. Now, this is actually fairly simple to define, and in WRG it's basically these sort of figures. I always base 2 per base, but there aren't too many of them. And what is the difference between these irregular skirmishing infantry and, let's say, light infantry in a skirmish mode? A lot more research was required by myself in order to understand exactly these differences. Let's try and understand how this all works by looking at a typical order of battle and how the troop types fitted into it. In this case, the Prussian army at Waterloo, specifically the 1st Brigade, in this case the 1st Infantry Brigade. First, the yaga, 100 to the 12th Regiment and 224 with the 1st Landwehr. These will almost certainly be irregular skirmish infantry, which would provide skirmishing services for the line infantry. One thing I did find interesting is that I can never remember fielding a single element of yagas with WRG, yet this makes it clear that my regiment should have a single element of yaga. With rules where the scale telescopes up to 1,000 men per element, or 500 skirmishes per element, then the entire brigade would have a single element of yaga, if I was going to be historically accurate. The Schutzen company of 275 men would be similar to the yaga, but clearly were at brigade level rather than regimental level. I suspect these were also rifle armed, and the yaga in this particular case were field yaga, which were armed with muskets. The final element in this puzzle is each element, at least the line elements, consists of 1 Fusilier and 2 musketeer battalions. The Fusiliers are classed as light infantry and presumably could completely dispense into skirmish mode. I'm not aware if this actually occurred at Digny, and possibly only part of the Fusilier adopted this formation, but it was possible. Presumably the musketeer battalion would not commonly deploy any skirmishes, although I'm sure it must have had this capability, because why wouldn't it have the capability? Let's try and work out how these troops were organised based on Prussian regulations. This comes from the 1812 Prussian regulations and shows an attack formation, in this particular case a brigade. In this case, half of a Fusilier battalion is in line and another half battalion or less is in what is called a skirmish line. All these troops come from the 1st Battalion. The Fusilier battalion on the flanks, that is half on each flank, may be ready to adopt skirmish mode if required, or could possibly retain compact order. There are 4 musketeer battalions, all in column. One is called a grenadier battalion. In the rear we see 3 squadrons of cavalry and a battery of artillery. I have never adopted troops or deployed troops in this manner when I played WRG. Perhaps this is why I kept on losing. When the Landwehr were introduced, this was modified. There are no Jager or Schutzen troops here. However, I suspect they were added on an ad hoc basis, so would not be the formation or in the basic formations regulations. Let's now look at the French, in this case the 1st Division of the 1st Corps at Waterloo. There is 1 light infantry regiment and 4 line regiments. I suspect by Waterloo the light infantry may have been fighting in the same manner as line formations. I found it very difficult to find any French regulations which provided me with a deployment layout similar to the Prussian regulations of 1812. This is about the closest I could find, and it's a blurry picture from a French manual which was dated 1837, showing the layout of an attack formation. Unfortunately, my French is hopeless and I cannot confirm what the formations are, but my guess is that they are battalions. That is, the small little boxes are battalions. There are 4 battalions per brigade and there are 2 brigades, so this represents a French division. The skirmishes must come from one of 2 sources: the voltigeurs, which come from all the battalions, or from the light infantry regiment. I suspect it's from the voltigeurs, and the light infantry are used as line infantry or indistinguishable from line infantry. Assuming 6 metres per 2 skirmishes and a backup 2 skirmishes, we end up with 1 skirmisher covering 12 line musketeers. This means 90 men from each of the 4 front battalions are all you need to provide an adequate skirmish line. I'm not even certain if the light infantry would be in the front line in this case, as this is an attack formation. We will now need to dig into a little bit more detail to determine if the French did the same as the Prussians, that is, were the skirmishers all from a single type of battalion, or were the skirmishers basically their best skirmishing troops from every battalion that happened to be at least in the front line. This is the alternative setup. It's highly unlikely in this case that half a light infantry battalion are allocated in the skirmish line in the front and the other half in a thin line behind. The French, as we've already discussed, can provide all the skirmish cover they need from the voltigeurs in both the line and light regiments. However, there were cases where the light regiment did actually break up as a skirmish. This quote from Gino may give us a clue. In this case, 1 whole battalion was in skirmish mode. This is of the French light infantry regiment, and the other in line, which matches up with the half-half deployment. However, in this case, at the whole battalion level, that is, the whole battalion, light battalion, was actually deployed in skirmish mode. The quote goes as follows. In 1806 at Gina, the French 16th Light Infantry advanced left in front towards the woods. Its 3rd Battalion advanced en tréliards in skirmish order towards the woods. The 1st and 2nd Battalion, marching still in column, went past the right of the woods and deployed into line in the plain at musket range from the Prussian battery. In summary, the light infantry could deploy an entire battalion into skirmish mode when the tactical situation warrants it, and it could do it well, although there are examples of whole line infantry battalions doing the same when covering a retreat or in defence. In this example, it was used in an attack, which would indicate that this must have been part of standard doctrine of the light infantry regiments. Now, I did find another diagram, which is not a primary source. However, it doesn't really give me enough information about where the skirmish troops were positioned and where they came from, and is quite general. But nonetheless, it kind of backs up the earlier diagrams, which show that most formations were not simply a line. It typically consisted of at least 2 lines, as you see here, or 3 lines of battalions, as you saw in the previous diagrams from the French manual of 1837. After going through all this source material, we may ask ourselves a question. Why bother with these damn skirmishes? Just send the troops in to clear the field. The answer is that it took a lot of effort and time to form rank and prepare for an attack, or even a defence. At Marengo, it took the Austrians between 1 and 2 hours to form up their attack formations and attack the French. While troops, which were prepared, were waiting, they would be simply twiddling their thumbs. This also occurred at Jena. That is, the Prussians took several hours to form up their attack there as well. This seems to be a fairly common thing. Now, if you could get some sharpshooters in range to disrupt the enemy formations, you could delay their attack or weaken their defence. Thus, skirmishes are actually a significant part of breaking up this, let's say, forming up period. Here we have a French and Prussian line facing each other, but the French have more skirmishes. We see here the French skirmishers have overwhelmed the Prussian skirmishers, which means they could now conduct long-range fire against the forming Prussian formations. It's hard to wait twiddling your thumbs when you're under fire. Men start taking cover and thus break up their nice neat formations. This delays the attack or weakens the attack and absolutely destroys morale, as occurred with the Prussians at Jena. In 1806 at Jena, French skirmishers took on enemy line infantry deployed in open field, or in a open field. Moore describes this action. Now followed one of the most extraordinary and pitiful incidents in military history. This line of magnificent infantry, some 20,000 strong, stood out in the open for 2 hours while exposed to the merciless case and skirmish fire of the French, who behind garden walls offered no mark at all for their return fire. You could fill no man's land with skirmishes, but once the density gets high enough, it becomes closer to compact formations. Thus, a good target for concentrated fire by the opposing line infantry. As a result, there was a natural limit to the amount of skirmishes. But if you could win the skirmish battle, you basically had won half the battle before the actual core troops had met each other. After being peppered by long-range fire for several hours, I would imagine the morale of the Prussians were very low. Their order was disrupted, which meant that if they attacked, they would not do so very well, and if they were attacked, they would be probably ready to run. So then, you need to identify what an optimal density of skirmishers were in no man's land. The densities seemed to vary greatly, from 6 metres per pair of men to something much greater. The idea was to never offer a good target for unaimed fire, and having a pair meant there was always one man, in theory, able to fire while the other reloaded. If it was common for the skirmishers to fire their entire load of ammunition, which could be 60 or 80 rounds, which meant they then had to go back for more ammo, which they often did. When this occurred, men in the first line, that is the solid line behind, would replace them, or alternatively, there would be, well, let's say from their third rank, which normally wasn't that effective in a line, or alternatively there were skirmishers in the rear ready to take the place of the skirmishers in the front. This also occurred with casualties, that is, replace any casualties. It's possible this replacement occurred with formation further behind, always leaving the first line fully manned. I'm certain about this, but the idea before the main action occurred was that, the main point was that no man's land was actually a hive of activity. This is, of course, a very high-level view, but it does explain why we bother having light infantry. If you don't have light infantry, you can't form up your men in an adequate way and attack or defend with full effectiveness. The next question I had to ask myself was, why bother having special light infantry formation if the skirmish requirements were satisfied by sharpshooters from each standard battalion? The answer is complex, but was a combination of new ideas flowing through very slowly, and the other was training. Skirmish troops need to have reasonable proficiency in firing musket and the ability to find good cover and fire at a good target. The Russians were considered as poor skirmishers only because of this lack of training or experience. The Russians did form entire battalions into skirmish formations, but they were not very good at skirmishing. Any battalion could send out skirmishers, but until the men had sufficient training, their effectiveness was limited. In one British quote, a commander noticed some of the skirmishers would empty their ammunition load on the ground so they could get out of no man's land with the excuse they were reloading. I imagine this was very common. I still need to identify what this optimum density was. I have some ideas so far based on the official manuals from the Prussians and possibly from the French, but I don't really have a very firm view. I found it very hard to find any official guides for skirmish frontages. The Prussian had half a fusilier battalion that was deployed as a skirmish formation to cover about 600 paces, or about 360 to 400 meters. Possibly there were 2 lines with men rotating in and out of no man's land. The frontage value I could find were 6 metres per a pair of men, which seems to roughly align with this. This was considered a reasonably good density, or optimal density, and would be similar to the French skirmish line. I expect any greater density and it becomes too good a target for mass fire, or perhaps a cavalry charge. In the early war period, the skirmish densities of the coalition were far less than this, as occurred with the Prussians at Jena. This simply resulted in the skirmishes being quickly cleared by the French. And the other quotes that I had with frontages were things like, for each pair, 20 metres, and that's probably the coalition in the early war period, and probably that density was not such a good density to deploy. In order to try and explain why bother having light troops, perhaps the answer was urban fighting. Perhaps that's where they shone. As you can see by this painting, it was a rather messy affair. This depicts the Russian attack on Plessiant. This ordeal was a very messy brawl rather than an organised battle. Over the din of combat, a commander would be lucky if you could make any sort of organised attack beyond a simple bayonet charge, and once this happened, it was win or run, as the men would be too scattered to command. The question is, would light troops or yaga have an advantage in this type of fighting? Probably not, as it was a combination of fire combat and especially bayonet charges. Yaga would not be capable of the latter, although light troops would. I see minimal advantage for yaga in built-up areas, unless it was an isolated strongpoint and fire combat was the main type of combat, as occurred at Waterloo, where the British manned a farmhouse and used long-range fire to great effect until they had to withdraw because they ran out of ammunition. If urban fighting was not what light troops were really designed to be engaged in, what about woods? Skirmish combat in light woods probably would benefit yaga with their focus on fire combat. But the main benefit of being in woods seems to be protection against cavalry. However, even in this case, cavalry could actually benefit from woods, as line infantry formations could not optimally form in a wood, as the Russians discovered at Berezina in 1812, and could be vulnerable if there was enough gaps for horses to charge through. In the Battle of Berezina in 1812, battalions of the Russian 18th Infantry Division stood in the wood. There were two small meadows, open patches, in the woods in which the infantry were posted. The Russians were formed in column and did not expect cavalry attack because of the forest cover. General Dormek struck the Russians with the 4th, 7th and 14th Cuirassier regiments, totaling 450 men. The Cuirassiers passed through the brush and woods, reformed and fell on the enemy. They sabred 500 to 750 men and took 2,000 prisoners. So woods were a little bit risky. However, in this particular case, the infantry were in a clear spot. I would imagine that infantry would be pretty safe if they were in woods, as you could see here, and I could see the benefit of light infantry because they're trained to operate individually, and if you're fighting in a wood, being forced to fight in individually is probably the kind of fighting you would normally do. This picture here shows how woods would benefit yaga and light troops, because they would be more inclined to be able to operate independently as long as the woods were thick enough. Open woods seem to be less advantageous for these troop types. You must remember that in theory any infantry formation could disperse. It was getting them form up in compact formation which was the trick. Thus any infantry formation could disperse in order to move through woods. We can also assume they were able to fight in such terrain, but the key point is experience and training. If fighting a guerrilla war, woods and bad terrain were great, but that was not going to win any battles for you. However, if your forces were not used to formations, that is forming up in line column, then woods were the great equalizer, as the American Indians discovered when facing US troops. So if the enemy had to take the woods and your guys were light and yaga type, then you were in a fairly good position. But at the very most, all you could hope to do is equalise your position against, let's say, regular troops. Thus, in summary, skirmish formations, such as yaga, were designed to provide skirmishes for your line infantry, and light infantry formations, such as the French ligueurs, were able to fully form into skirmish mode when the tactical situation warranted, but normally they would not do so in a normal line situation. This gave them a slight edge in some situations, such as in woods, possibly in urban conflicts, and possibly for manoeuvring purposes to get around things quickly. But it was not enough reason to actually have these troop types by themselves. There must be some other reasons. Let's continue to drill down to see if we can clarify the situation further. First, we'll look at light infantry formations and skirmish infantry formations of the major combatants. While all troops could, in theory, adopt skirmish formation, these were the troops which either were part of a formation which would fully adopt this formation or were only designed to fight in this manner. As a result, they would be considered as very good skirmishers. In most cases, the light infantry are of regimental size. In some cases, I'll include battalion-sized light infantry formations as well. The skirmish formations would be of any size, but are normally independent company-sized formations. In some cases, although rare, they are battalion-sized. One point which I did feel was valid was that raw skirmishers were of little value. They need to be well trained and reasonably experienced. Otherwise, they would simply run away or be totally ineffective at the battlefield. Raw skirmishers are closer to guerrillas rather than useful troop types on a battlefield. Starting with the Austrians, the grensas were considered as light infantry. I'm wondering if they could adopt a compact formation, but I suspect there was no reason why they could not. However, based on their origin, I expect they would be mainly used in a skirmish mode. The yaga were true skirmishers armed with rifle and not suitable to compact formation in the line in any way, shape or form. The French had their famous légers, or light infantry. Up to a quarter of the line consisted of this infantry type in many of the campaigns, and they were initially considered as not optimal for compact formation in the line. By Waterloo, this distinction had gone away, but the formation was still capable of entirely forming skirmish mode, although how often this occurred is an interesting question. The French also had the voltigeurs. These were formed from the line and light regiments, or battalions. In 1804, each French line and light infantry battalion was ordered to create one company of 90 of the best shots who would serve as elite skirmishers. The voltigeurs were skilled at sharpshooting and received specific training in marksmanship, using cover and taking the initiative. The French did not seem to have any specific rifle-armed skirmishers, which from memory was something Napoleon specifically preferred. I expect they used German allies in this role, if required. The Prussians possess Schützen and yaga, armed respectively with rifle and musket. There was a guard yaga-Schützen formation, armed with a rifle as well. I'm unsure if this was considered yaga or Schützen. These were all skirmish troops designed to only skirmish and nothing else. The Fusiliers were also trained for skirmish role as light infantry, although it seemed the entire Fusilier battalion was not normally deployed to skirmish. I'm a bit uncertain here, as my sources do vary. I've placed them here because I feel they were light infantry, similar to the French légers. However, they were only deployed at battalion strength, and it appears only part of the formation went into a skirmish mode, so they could actually reside in the later part of this video, where I talk about formations which only part formed a skirmish. This is something that I'm a little bit uncertain about based on the sources I've read at the present moment. My gut feeling is that it could and was trained to form a skirmish formation in its totality if required, but probably this was not done very often, similar to the French légers, or light infantry regiments or battalions. I'm not very familiar with the English, but the light infantry would have functioned as, guess what, light infantry, and I assume the rifle battalions as skirmish troops if required. The British were well equipped with skirmish troops, as their standard battalion possessed excellent skirmish capability. I expect this was probably a result of their fracas in North America, where they were kind of disadvantaged by their lack of skirmish troops. Regardless, I suspect the British probably had the best skirmish formations and structure of all the combatants. At the other end of the spectrum are the Russians. The Prussians considered the only good skirmish troops the Russians possessed were their yaga, which were probably considered as light infantry rather than pure skirmish troops. The Finnish grenadiers may have been pure skirmishing troops, I'm uncertain. The Russians did deploy skirmishers from their standard formations, and sometimes a whole battalion was deployed in this manner, but they were not considered very effective. Skirmishing was one area the Russians had a difficulty with, probably right up until the end of the war. We've already covered the French voltigeurs, who were taken from the line and light regiments. Even the Prussian fusiliers and French light infantry did not commonly fight in a full skirmish mode on a common basis. On the other hand, all troops could fight in a skirmish mode if required. It's just their proficiency would not be high if not trained or prepared for this type of combat. I suspect these two formations I've just mentioned were actually trained for this, unlike most other battalions. Thus, we will investigate the ability of normal battalion strength formations to provide a skirmish screen as distinct from, let's say, the voltigeurs or fusiliers, and for them to be able to adopt a full skirmish mode. Is it possible, and how good were they at it? I need to now come back to the question of how many skirmishes do I actually need? That is, what is the density? This question I will be covering many times in this video because it's such an important question, and it really does explain how skirmishes are used, why they were used, and also the quality differences between nationalities. Okay, previously in the video I indicated a density of about 1 in 16, which means one skirmisher for each 16 men in the line. This is probably a minimum requirement. This would probably provide a reasonable skirmish screen, but does not provide for casualties or basically men being forced to go back to get ammunition when they run out of ammunition. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Now, we know that the Prussians used the entire third rank in a line to provide the skirmish troops. This seems like a lot of skirmishes, but could have been only done in the forward battalions of the whole regimental or brigade formation. Thus, while it's a 1 in 3 ratio for the battalion, there would have been battalions behind which provided no skirmishes. Thus, the overall ratio could have been closer to the 1 in 12, for example. In our 1812 example, a maximum of a half to 1/3 of a battalion was used as skirmishes, with the rest of the battalion in line. The total number of battalions in this case was 6, so the ratio of 1 in 12 is correct for the entire brigade or regiment. As a result, at this particular scale, or formation scale, I'll use this ratio as my optimum ratio, 1 in 12. The ratio basically depends on the formation that you're looking at. At a battalion level, a ratio of 1:3 or 1:4 or 1:5 is probably likely. At a regimental level, as rear regiments do not need to provide skirmishes, the ratio would be far less. As we indicated up till now, or in this video, in this slide, up to 3 times less. Thus we end up with our optimal regimental ratio of 1 in 12. What I'll be going for is the optimum battalion ratio is 1 in 4, and the optimal regiment or brigade ratio is probably 1 in 12. Now let's look at effectiveness. Not all skirmishes were equal, and the ratios may have differed, which would affect how good a battalion size formation was at skirmishing. So these are the two factors which affect the effectiveness of skirmishing. That is, the skill and how many guys do you actually send out. We know at Jena the Prussians' skirmish ability, both numbers and skill, were so low as to effectively affect the morale of the line infantry, which found themselves under a hail of skirmish fire for several hours, unable to respond. I, for one, would not wish to be in that position, and could explain why the poor old Prussians collapsed so rapidly at Jena-Olstadt. Now, the numbers, if we just focus on that, are easy to determine. Early in the war, the French probably used more skirmishes than they needed, and the coalition far less than they needed. By 1806, Napoleon had identified the ideal ratio, which resulted in a much more significant effect against the Prussians in 1806, for example, than possibly early in the war against their revolutionary French enemies. After this, the Prussians and the Austrians learnt their lesson and beefed up their skirmish numbers to an optimal level, perhaps going overboard at some times, but in terms of numbers they had learned the lesson well. The Russians were an odd case, but presumably they also got the numbers right but suffered from quality issues. The British never had an issue. They learnt their lessons well when fighting the Americans, had both the numbers and quality to achieve this magic level of perfection. The quality topic is hard to quantify, as how do you measure it? We know that the Russians may have ensured that there were always enough skirmishes in the no man's land at the front by 1812, but their quality was poor. In the end, they had to mainly rely on separate yaga formation for the bulk of their good skirmishing capability. The Austrians and Prussians also depended on specialist skirmishing troops, although the Prussians did have their fusiliers. The British quality was possibly the best after their experience in the Americas, and the French were probably the next most generally experienced in skirmishing. To insist in understanding this question, I will rely on a set of rules, in this case Empire 3rd edition, to give me an idea of the overall quality and effectiveness of skirmishes by nationality. As by 1809 to 1812 at least, the numbers were not such a major factor, we can attribute any difference from this point on to pure quality. Apart from their rifles and light infantry formations, which could fully adopt a skirmish formation as part of their standard tactics, and which we've already covered in the previous part of the video, the other standard regiments or battalions were basically broken up by centre and flank companies, with the flank companies possessing superior skirmishing capabilities. Unless you're going to break down the entire regiment into a skirmish formation, we can ignore the centre companies and only look at the flank companies, and the result is obvious. British skirmish capability is excellent, according to this. The British clearly have no skirmishing issues, and this is kind of borne out by history, particularly if we deal with 1815. If we look at the French skirmishers were considered as excellent. The inline infantry could always depend on their fusiliers, but regardless they had their tirailleurs as well to give them excellent skirmish capability. Putting aside the Marines, we have everyone at excellent in terms of providing skirmishes to mask line infantry. If these formations were to totally break down into skirmish mode, many line infantry formations would be probably classed at a lower quality, possibly even poor. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what is the quality of the skirmishes that a formation would be able to send out to provide what was required to cover the actual formation to the rear. I have no idea why the 10th, 11th and 57th Line Infantry were so good, but according to Empire 3rd, they were. No skirmish issues here, move on to the next nationality. Well, clearly the Austrians were clearly not so hot in the area of skirmishing. I assume the grensas were only average because of poor discipline, possibly also why the yagas were not so good. If I was an Austrian commander, I would not be forming up my forces for an extended period of time with this quality of skirmishing. This could also be the reason why the Austrians often deployed a very large number of skirmishes as compared with the French post-1806. I would have to assume the poor basically means your skirmishes were totally ineffective and was another way of saying you did not possess any effective skirmishing capability. Average meant you probably needed a lot of men in order to cover the no man's land area, but good probably allowed you to hold your own against the excellent French skirmishers, but there was little a chance of getting the jump on the French with this sort of lineup. Let's look at the Prussians. We need to divide the Prussians into, 1806 and prior, and of course 1812 and latter. The story in 1806 was not very good for the poor old Prussians. Apart from their small number of yagas, their skirmish quality was rather poor, and this pretty much bore out in the campaigns in 1806. It's interesting that during the campaigns during the Revolutionary Wars, while the Prussians probably had a hard time meeting the French skirmishers, they weren't sort of battered as badly. I suspect in the early Revolutionary Wars, the French infantry themselves were extremely poor quality, so they had to send out a lot of skirmishers in order to take over a no man's land. So when the Prussians, although the Prussians always lost the skirmish wars, I'm only guessing here, when their infantry actually went into combat, even though possibly the morale of the infantry was a bit low, the infantry always prevailed. Anyway, that's my theory. The other theory, of course, is that Napoleon cleaned up the whole French skirmish situation, so by 1806 had achieved some kind of optimal perfection, which the Prussians, although they experienced the skirmishes in the revolutionary period, had not quite experienced such a devastatingly optimal skirmish force and suffered as a result. Anyway, guesswork on my part. By 1812, if not earlier, the Prussians had certainly learnt their lesson well and ended up with reasonably good skirmish formations such as yaga and Schützen. Within the line infantry, the story was much better than 1806, but certainly not as good as the French. But with the yaga formations, the Prussians were now able to hold their own against the French, if not being able to win any skirmish battle in no man's land. This is an interesting point. The coalition, apart from the British, may not have been able to meet or match the French in terms of skirmishes from their standard formations, So what they did was that they utilised specialist formations. When you're trailing an enemy, what you do is you gather together the lower number of the best troops you've got, which could meet the enemy's skills, so to speak, and then use them as required to match the enemy. It's a good tactic, and I suspect that's probably what the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians did. Now let's look at the poor old Russians. Once again, we need to divide the Russians up in pre-1811 and post-1811. Before 1811, the Russian story was very poor indeed. But by 1812, the grenadiers possessed some reasonable skirmish ability. Some yaga formations were good, but the rest poor. Russia probably had the worst story in terms of skirmishing, and it was not due to lack of numbers. The Russians themselves stated it was mainly due to lack of discipline and skill. Must be pointed out these values from Empire 3 are very subjective, and several values make no sense, such as comparing the Austrian Grens with, let's say, the French line infantry. Skirmish quality would depend on number of skirmishes, both total and system in place to ensure this value was maintained when casualties occurred and when men went to the rear to resupply, and of course skill and discipline, skill at firing a rifle or musket and skill at finding cover, and discipline, which kept skirmishers doing the things that they did and firing at the optimal targets. This chart that you see up here is kind of my interpretation of Empire 3, modified a bit, showing the quality based on the troop types. Any other differences would be explained by, let's say, morale, for example. So, for example, line infantry, which would be considered poor, and then when you compare that with Landwehr, which is also poor, the difference is the fact that Landwehr also has a lower morale. By the latter half of the war, all combatants would have worked out what the correct number of skirmishes were and the system to maintain their numbers in no man's land, especially by 1815. I don't believe numbers were a factor, certainly by 1812, and probably even as early as 1809. Let's now look at the other factors, skill and discipline. Skill at firing a weapon could be determined easily. Yaga, for example, would have the highest level of skill because they were hunters. They did this all the time. Only a little bit of additional training was required, so they could probably, identify the optimal target, etc. Skill at finding cover is possibly a little bit more difficult to quantify, but I would imagine yaga, again, as they're hunters, which are hiding from their prey, should be optimal at that as well, although their prey is not firing back at them, so maybe their ability to find cover is slightly different. Okay, a bit of training is required there, but I would imagine that yagas should be okay in that area. Now, discipline was the area where the poor old yaga probably fell down. Even the yaga probably would not have the discipline to keep on fighting when ordered, when bullets were flying everywhere in some situations, and ensuring they targeted the optimal target. The French and British had the best, hand in this case, and they would buy the best. And I think this is the key difference in skirmishing abilities. The other or final factor, which is not directly related to skirmishing, is the overall morale or quality or ability of the troops, such as raw and militia troops would be poor at skirmishing, even if they were hunters in real life, because they were militia and raw and they just lacked so much of the additional stuff that made them a good soldier. Elite and veteran troops would have the discipline to be good skirmishers, as long as they were given some basic training. So even if these guys were not hunters or particularly good at what skirmish was supposed to do, elite and veteran would have the discipline to overcome that to an extent. Now, we know that these formations could fully break up into a skirmish formation. So we have to assume that they were given that minimal level of additional training necessary at becoming skirmishers. So instantly, elite and veteran, you would expect to have some skirmish ability. Average and trained were your basic baseline. So this kind of thing was an overall modifier for your skirmish abilities. Let's look at the final calculation. Once you factor in the basic morale, skill and discipline, you should be able to arrive at some level of quality. Thus, it seems unusual the Austrian Grens were considered as average and the French line as excellent. But as indicated, this is highly subjective, and WRG, for example, only considers numbers and basic morale when determining skirmish capability. And in those rules, the Grens are better than the French line, and equal to the French light infantry, which probably is closer to the truth. Anyway, different rules deal with this in different ways, and basically, individual players will need to decide what they prefer. Now we come to the conclusion. In conclusion, looks like I'm going to have to do some rebasing. Irrespective of the rules you use, all infantry, except those which do nothing but fight in skirmish mode, need to be based in the same density, that is, compact order. Those units able to skirmish would probably need a double base. So when an element decides to skirmish, it's replaced with a number of skirmish elements. So if you have a compact formation unit, let's say French light infantry, and you decide you want to send out some skirmishes, you're going to have to take your 4-figure base and replace it with 2 2-figure bases, or probably more accurately 4 1-figure bases, which do tend to look a bit odd, and I'm certainly not going to go down that particular path. If the rule scale was high enough, you could build any standard skirmishing into the combat system. Thus, this double basing would not be needed for most units. Only those units which could only fully skirmish would need double bases, and it's possible the game system could also compensate for this. For example, Prussian yaga could be attached to a line infantry battalion to give it an extra skirmish oomph, but I suspect this still requires having a skirmish element to depict this special oomph ability. All this depends on the rules being used, but what I'm trying to do is to create a force mix which can accommodate any set of rules over a wide range of scales. In some cases it's not possible, so light infantry and DBN have to be depicted in 3 infantry elements. However, even here, as long as the figures were clearly a specific light infantry troop type, you would still recognise them as light infantry. Thus, you could still retain a 4-figure per base, and it would still work regardless. So now let's look at, in more detail, how I'm going to be basing my skirmishes. Almost all the rules use a system of half bases for skirmishes, which come from the line and keep the density the same. To avoid double basing, each player has some of his elements as half elements, which can then be deployed as skirmishes. Players are expected to ensure gaps on either side of such a half element, as it actually represents a larger area, but this avoids players double basing. The only issue is players will have to deal with half bases. When we move to a pure skirmish element, the element density drops. Empire 3 is possibly the most accurate, with each skirmish figure occupying a 2-inch wide base, which is wider than the standard 1 1/2 inch wide base. The other rules use standard with bases and simply place 2 figures on each base. This represents the actual figure density skirmishes are supposed to occupy, so it may not be actually technically correct, but may be a middle ground. Now what we see here are all the rules, so with the exception of Empire 3, they all pretty much use the same system. But as I indicated before, Empire 3, the bottom left corner, is probably the accurate frontage for true skirmish elements, if you assume my 1 in 4 ratio that we've just currently derived. And Empire's done it by themselves in their own basing system, so I suspect this is probably fairly close to reality. Thus, based on my battalion ratio 1 in 4, the most accurate skirmish basing density should be 1 figure per standard base, which is approximately what Empire 3 does. The 2 figures per element could represent a compromise, as it may look better, but is probably not accurate. Regardless, I suspect if you're fielding a 12 element skirmish formation, 12 figure, having 12 elements may be a little bit much in your storage box, so maybe that's the reason why they do it. So they go for the 2 rather than 1 as a kind of a compromise. Using as an example a 4-element battalion, if one element was converted into a skirmisher, for example, it would be deployed as 2 half bases, as you can see on the left. This works, but I must admit, probably does not look nice, and you need to remember that the bases need to have gaps on either side. Otherwise you don't get the correct density. If we use the Empire 3 frontages, and I must admit Empire 3, to avoid double basing, does use the WRG system as well for line infantry, but assuming players are happy with a double basing their figures in their standard line troops, we see the effect on the right. the right top. This looks a lot better and correctly represents skirmish density. Thus, for a player, the choice is as follows. If you are happy with half bases and don't wish to double base, use the WRG system on the left. If you do not like half bases and are happy with double basing, use the system on the right, either the top right, which is the Empire correct skirmish density, or the bottom right, which is the compromise solution, which players may prefer. I'm personally erring towards the top right solution, which one against requires more rebasing. However, I may retain my skirmishes, that is the skirmish units like yagas, in 2 figures per base for movement, only replacing them with a 1 figure per base when they adopt a true skirmish formation. This allows me to adopt either the top or bottom right solution. It's rare to have more than 12 actual skirmish elements, so it does not represent a lot of extra figures. I am suspecting I may consider something similar for skirmish cavalry as well. Look, it's all about a compromise. You know, when skirmishers adopt a true skirmish formation, they're pretty spread out, and I like the look of that spread out effect. You see this in 6mm basing, where you have a single base which has the line and the skirmishers in front. It looks nice. Using the Empire 3 system that I'm showing here, top right corner, you can actually duplicate that with more traditional elements. It just means you need to buy more elements and base them accordingly. Well, if you create an optimal army list and ensure that you have no more than, let's say, 40 or 60 elements per side, this does not represent a lot of bases or elements or figures. And it gives you the opportunity to do some fancy diorama on the bases as well. It's probably the direction I will be definitely going down. And so we come again to the conclusion of my rebasing video, in this case part 33, covering skirmishing during the Napoleonic War. Now I'm off to start rebasing my Napoleonic figures again. Luckily, I don't have that many figures that I need to rebase, unlike my heavy and medium cavalry. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hill, Heimatland zu kämpfen.